A shock, but no longer a surprise. Europe weighing its words after Washington's publication of an official policy paper that warns that this old continent is under threat of, quote, civilisational erasure with fading powers overrun by migrants. It's the logical follow-up to Vice President JD Vance admonitions back in February at the Munich Security Conference. A policy paper that goes far beyond the unexplained absence of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio at last week's NATO foreign ministers meeting. An irrational about-face on historic ties with the continent, or is this period we've seen the last 80 years the real outlier? Washington, after World War II, taking upon itself to ensure Europe's defense in the name of fighting Soviet expansion. Before that, the U.S. was a much more isolationist place. Our panel scrutinizes the premise that Europe's in economic and moral decline, how it's adapting to this wild swing in superpower alliances, and whether it's got what it takes to fend for itself. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what is the response to this claim of civilisational erasure? With us, his latest book, This America That Hates Us, follows a post-election U.S. road trip. Richard Verly, Paris correspondent for Swiss news outlet Blick. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Francois.
Franco-American spokesperson for Republicans Overseas France, Nicolas Conquer. You ran for parliament last year.
Also, in France.
With the backing of Marine Le Pen's party. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
His podcast is called Dirty Politics. Philippe Bonchorollet, Senior Communications Advisor at the NOCOM.
Hello, Francois.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
And nice to welcome from Brussels, Giuseppe Spatafora, Research Analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Welcome back to the show.
Hi.
You can, by the way, always listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. The National Security Strategy paper was published last Friday, and it does talk of a Europe that's vitally important to U.S. interests, but also in an economic decline, quote, eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilisational erasure. It also says the larger issue facing Europe includes activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech, and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, and loss of national identities and self-confidence. A lot of points there to go through. This is about much more than just the gradual withdrawal from assuring Europe's secure defense shield. I'll begin with you, Giuseppe Spatafora. Were people in Brussels surprised?
I guess it depends who you ask. Personally, I was not that surprised because we have seen this document coming for a long time. There was, back in April, a memo from the State Department that talked about Europe being a challenge to Western civilization. So in a sense, this is not novelty. And we know that these tropes are typical to the Trump administration. You mentioned the Vance speech back in February. The point is that this national security strategy goes away from what usual NSS usually do, which is set the priorities of the United States to defend against threats across the world, which are usually state-based threats. In fact, it was Trump's first national security strategy in 2017 that identified strategic competition between Russia and China against the US as the big challenge. And now that is basically gone. China is still there, but Russia is not seen as a threat, and therefore Europe is no longer a useful ally. And that gives space to talk about these other issues that make Europe actually a potential issue for the United States, at least in civilizational terms.
Is Europe's civilizational qualms a national security threat for the United States, Nicolas Conquer?
So this document is going to lay out the strategy to face these threats. It puts means and it puts goals, and it also focuses on these areas. Part concerning Europe says promoting Europe's greatness and then ensuring that Europe gets great again. So facing its flaws, basically bureaucracy, lack of defending our own identities, and being overhauled by mass migration. So that's basically a threat that's going to affect Europe, but also as are on the forefront from this civilisational battle that might in turn affect the U.S. So we clearly see that there is an arc here, as they put it in their document. They're in the Western Hemisphere, but this arc going from the U.S. back to Europe needs to be fostered. And we have this common civilizational battle to be.
Civilizational battle. What does that mean? What does civilizational erasure mean?
Civilizational, as it's put on, it means like the identities that you're being defined by might no longer hold still if you're totally being erased, not by controlled migration, but just by eras of uncontrolled migration, which is being depicted. As just to put it in a simply, the Frontex numbers are 1.2 illegal entries of illegal migrants per year in Europe. So that definitely is going to affect your institutions, your identities, and your security in a whole.
As we speak, Philippe Chevrolet, the European Commission is getting set to submit to Parliament a further tightening of the borders when it comes to illegal entries. Is migration uncontrolled? Is that is there a point that Donald Trump has here? Is there a chance that Europe's civilization could be erased by migrants?
You know, that's an interesting question. We all remember what happened on September 11, 2001, right? We all remember that. But do you remember what happened on September 12, the day after? All the NATO countries, unanimous, voted their support for the US that had been attacked by foreign people, foreign groups. They decided to, unlock the Article 5 of the NATO treaty. That was the first time in history that we did that. That's civilization. That's what we share with the US. This capacity, this audacity to be there when things go wrong. What is unprecedented in this text is that all of that is thrown away to garbage by people that are really, really, concerned by attacking us in our identity, in our culture, in the way we have to welcome foreigners, to welcome strangers. And in the US, 1 year ago, they were the same. They were welcoming strangers, migrants. I mean, the whole US has been built on this generosity. I didn't interrupt you. Please, in the name of free speech, Nicolas Coquer, in the name of free speech, let me talk. I didn't interrupt you. I love free speech, Nicolas. Free speech is letting the other people speak.
One at a time.
You don't let the other people speak. You don't love free speech. I love free speech. Much more than you do, by the way. I didn't interrupt him, so I'm entitled to my free speech. Yes. What I wanted to say is that the US have been built on migrations. That's the whole mythology, the whole love that we have for the US is built on that. And by the way, some of the French people went there too. And part of the American blood is actually French. Not only the French fries, it's inside the people, François. And we need to believe in that still, even against this administration. Why? Because in a few months, Trump is wildly unpopular. He's got the worst polls that any president had in history since the polls exist. François. So we need to still believe in that and to keep that faith in order to be able to, reconcile ourselves with the next president and the next majority in the parliament, in the Congress, hopefully.
All right, this idea of a great replacement, it's something that Trump again revisited this Tuesday when interviewed by Politico, the U.S. president doubling down on this identity issue.
They're coming in from all parts of the world, not just the Middle East. They're coming in from the Congo, tremendous numbers of people coming from the Congo. And even worse, they're coming from prisons of the Congo and many other countries. Europe is, if you take a look at Paris, it's a much different place. I loved Paris. It's a much different place than it was. If you take a look at London, you have a mayor named Khan. He's a horrible mayor. He's an incompetent mayor, but he's a horrible, vicious, disgusting mayor. I think he's done a terrible job. London's a different place.
London's a different place. Richard Verly, we have a Swiss person here, so
okay. Let's be neutral.
Is Paris a different place than it used to be? First of all,
I do think so. I mean, I do think so. It's not because this document is clearly a political document. That's what I think. It's not a strategic document. It's a political roadmap given to national populist party in Europe to take power during and to win election. It's the document that the Trump administration is feeding them with ideas so they can raise it and say, we have Trump with us, all this national populist party all around Europe. Now, does it mean that Donald Trump is wrong when he say Paris has changed or London has changed? No, he's right. Let's face things. This document should be also read for what it is. There were changes have happened in Europe. It's true.
What are the changes?
Well, changes, migration has transformed partly the face of Paris. That is true. Then you decide whether you accept it and you integrate people, or you fight and you want to expel those people. That's another matter. But what I read in this document was exactly what I heard when I was on the campaign trail in America during 4 months. You remember we talked about it, Francois, last year. And those people I was talking with, they were not elected officials. They were not Republican Party executives. They were normal American people. And the reason why I wrote this book is I discovered that they can't stand Europe anymore. And for me, it was completely new. This is something I did not expect. And they were telling me exactly what is in this paper.
They can't stand Europe?
No, it doesn't mean that they don't like Europe. They still are happy to come and do tourism in Paris, but they believe we are decadent. They believe we are a continent of decline. They believe those MAGA people, probably Mr. Conker support them, they believe they are the holder of the Western civilization value. They are the holder of this value, and we are not defending those values. By the way, there is a lot of white supremacism into that too. That's and Christian supremacism. This is what I met when I talked with people coming out of the Costco, Walmart, in the campground as I was traveling in an RV. So no surprise. So let's not think that Donald Trump is thinking that and JD Vance only. A large bunch of MAGA voters do think that. So Europe has to respond, but it's not because we have to respond that we have to be blind. Let's also face realities, and sometimes Mr. Trump points out realities.
The number of foreign-born people in France, Giuseppe Spatafora, 20 years ago was around 8%. Today it's around 10%. This slight rise in the number of foreign-born people inside of each of the EU countries. Does that mean the countries have changed? Do you agree?
Well, that goes a little bit beyond my realm of expertise in the sense I do see changes. I was born in an age of migration, despite my hair. I'm relatively young in that sense. I do see that there are changes. I do believe that the union's policies are changing in a certain direction. In fact, I'm surprised sometimes that the US depicts Europe as being pro-migration in all aspects. In fact, the majority of parties in Europe right now, at least in the biggest country, they are to the center right, and they are supporting a reduction in migration numbers, or at least a tightening of those controls. So in that sense, it is surprising that it is still depicted in the United States, or at least by certain people in the US, as being very strongly pro-migration, when this is in fact changing significantly. And this can be applied to other things. If you think about competitiveness and regulation, the EU is right now reducing its regulation agenda and its practices in a way that it sort of goes in a direction that the US may like as well. So the point is that the shift is happening, at least in many ways, and it is surprising that, or at least we need to understand that in the United States, this is seen at least in part ideologically, that goes beyond the policies of the day as a trope that probably has electoral purposes as well, but it may not always reflect the reality.
When you heard Donald Trump there say, London has a mayor, his name is Khan, is that simply to say London has a mayor, he's a Muslim, and therefore it's not right for London to have a Muslim mayor? His name is Sadiq Khan, the mayor.
It's not a matter of who he is or what his identity is. It's just about.
It's not a dog whistle message.
That's just easy prone. It's just about how things are shifting and how you're having more communitarism. Should it be in the UK? Should you go look in Brussels or around Belgium? And as you see, there's more and more push of infringement on religious freedoms and pushes by Muslim communities. Should it be in France with the Musulmans de France? Antennas and ties with the Muslim Brotherhood that's being under investigation in the US. So those are clear threats that are affecting our European and Western societies.
Is Richard Verdi correct in stating that this is not a national security document, but a playbook for Trump's allies here in Europe?
I think Richard Verdi, despite his great talent in writing, is fully off target on this matter. Of course, it's a strategy. It defines the means and the goals, and it's as clear as it could be, as the day could be. And then it's absolutely egregious of mentioning that it has anything to do with white supremacy. I think you should take back those comments.
No, I did not say that these documents.
You're cherry-picking comments for.
No, I did not say. No, you got me wrong.
You said that.
I did not say that I did not say that there is white supremacism in the document. I say among the MAGA voters that I met, I could feel that there was white supremacism clearly, and the fact that they believe Christian values are superior to Muslim values. That's a fact. That's what I heard. Now, you may like it or not, but that's what I heard. I did not say, so I correct, sorry if you did not understand, I did not say it is in the document. It is in what I heard when I was in the US.
Your show on Télé said the opposite. Anyway, the fact is...
Come on, you've got true Nazis in the movement. I mean, Nick Fuentes is a Nazi. He's not moderate
He
Republican.
voted for Kamala Harris. Good point for you.
Okay,
Thanks for making the point.
He's not coherent, but that's even worse.
No, you're not. You're just trying to label people as that is.
Yeah, I like to label Nazis as Nazis.
Is he an elected official?
That's
Maybe
a good
not.
thing to label Nazis as Nazis. You don't believe in labeling Nazis.
Well, no, it's just because you're trying. Okay. Everybody's being labeled a Nazi.
You're entitled to your opinion.
Everybody's labeled Nazi today because
you're entitled to your opinion.
You're trying to suppress free speech. You're
entitled not to label Nazis.
One at a time, please.
Does that make any sense? Everybody
just finish. I respect your free speech. Please finish your speech.
You try to label people without.
Yes, I try to do it. When Nazis are in front of me, I try to label them as Nazis.
Lack of nuance. Once you disagree with somebody,
that's
you label
a lack
them
of
as
nuance.
Nazi.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
I am entitled to believe that.
Remember February? We talked about it at the outset of this show when the U.S. Vice President told European defense ministers and leaders in Munich that the biggest threat they faced was not Russia, but woke values. Well, Germany's chancellor remembers that moment.
What we read last week corresponds roughly to what the US Vice President JD Vance already said in his speech to the Munich Security Conference in February. Parts of this document are understandable, but some of it is unacceptable for us from the European point of view. That the Americans want to save democracy in Europe now, I don't see any need for that. If it needed to be saved, we'd manage that alone.
Now, Friedrich Merz making those remarks this Tuesday in the company of the governor of the state of Rhineland-Palatinate, a state that Richard Verdi visited. It is tucked away between Karlsruhe and Mannheim. There lies the wine-growing town of Karlstadt. Karlstadt famous because, Richard?
For two reasons. Because it's the native region of the Trump family, of Trump father, not on his mother's side. His mother's side comes from Scotland, but Trump father, Fred Trump, the first one. Keep in mind that Donald Trump is third generation, so it's his grandfather who migrated to the US, first in New York, and then he made his money in Yukon during the gold rush. And the second reason, and that's what I found very interesting when I was there, it's also there that the Heinz, the sauce that you use for barbecue, was created.
And the ketchup.
Exactly, the ketchup. And when you look at the two stories, the story of the Trump and the story of the Heinz, that's very different because on the Heinz side, you have Mr. John Kerry. He married he married the widow of a senator called Heinz, who was a Democrat. So I found it interesting that in this region of Karlstadt, you have those two America. One thing I wonder is why Donald Trump never went to Karlstadt. which is the birthplace of his family. And to me, that
He's been to
explains a lot.
Scotland.
Well, I would risk an analysis, and again, that's a personal bet. It's not a fact. So don't jump on me first. It's just a bet. I think he's got a problem with Germany, Donald Trump, and that's why he's always been very harsh on Germany. I do not know why, but I think this is something. And keep in mind that right after the Second World War, and that's a fact, his father, who was called Fred Trump as well, he pretended he was a Swedish and not a German because he had to deal with a Jewish financial institution after the war. Germans were very unpopular for reasons you can imagine. And for some years, the young Donald Trump had to pretend some way that he was from Sweden and not from Germany.
There was a Swedish Donald Trump for a while.
For a while.
It's amazing.
But I risk that. Does Donald Trump have a problem with Germany? I would like to know more. I would like to know more.
I want to get Giuseppe Spatafora. I want to get your reaction to an essential point brought up earlier by Richard, and that is, what is the reaction? When you were listening to that clip of the German chancellor, it sounds right now as though they're still trying to formulate what the reaction is to this policy paper from last Friday. It's already Tuesday. What are your thoughts?
Well, the difficulty in all this is that Europe is in a very complicated security environment, one in which it is difficult to live without the United States. If it were 2005, imagine this, if the situation had happened in 2005, we were close to that, but not to this scale, with the Iraq war rift, then Europe may have had bigger chances and strengths to do things, to say to the United States they would go sort of independent, they would cut contacts with the United States, they would sever trade ties and develop a defense structure that are separate and so on. Now it's very difficult because you know that for Ukraine, the Ukrainians need to buy US weapons because they're the one that the Ukrainians mostly need. They know that for defense, Europeans need to rely on American deterrence, at least on certain aspects, because it will take many years to develop the European ones. You know that on trade, it is difficult to keep prices low already. It would be even harder if there was a trade war with the United States. So for all these reasons, there's an attempt to try to keep a united front and not to antagonize the United States. The problem is that, of course, the reality is that a lot of these signals, including the strategy, including other signals such as the meetings between Witkoff and the Russians last week or the previous weeks, indicate that the US is moving in different directions, and it makes it harder and harder for Europeans to keep a united stance with the United States, while at the same time trying to defend their own interests against what I see as significant risks of aggression from the Russians, of course, not from the US. But it is difficult to work without the United States in that format.
Difficult to work without the United States, and the fear that on this continent that the war in Ukraine is not something theoretical but very real. Lithuania this Tuesday declaring a state of emergency over a surge of smugglers' balloons floating over from Belarus. France has revealed that it's shot down unidentified drones near a base off its Brittany coast that had wandered into restricted airspace, and then also shot unsuccessfully at drones that had hit at the end of November north of Paris near an airbase. Is there, there's the United States is far from Europe. This hybrid warfare, it is real and it is here, and you can understand why Europeans are nervous about all of this.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, they're on the forefront, and it's under neighboring garden. The fact is, everybody claims that Trump and the U.S. would withdraw from NATO, even in the first term, which he never did. He was actually, Trump and his administration were really the catalysts for the for the European nations who increased their military spendings already in the first term, and now there's some more commitments for the second one. So what we're really trying to do is enable them not to be freeloaders for the U.S. and have the U.S. taxpayer dollars finance the security and deterrence for the Europe, but for them to be able to face directly the threats and strengthen this NATO, which once again was said back before the European war, was in a state of cerebral and brain dead, as Emmanuel Macron would say.
Increasing that spending by European nations, will it be enough, though, to keep the U.S. on board? We saw the U.S. Secretary of State skip a foreign ministers meeting, which virtually never happens at the NATO level last week. And you reading through that document, that strategy paper from last Friday, there's the sense that the United States just doesn't seem all that involved in NATO anymore.
I think it gives a clear wake-up call for Europe, as in for stability and as on how strategic the links are between Europe and the States. I think you don't need to see it, should it be liberal or conservative, but as two nations, especially with France, that have 250 years of history, should you like the governance or not, you still need to maintain and foster the relationship, should it be military, but also cultural and business-wise, and therefore...
There's 38 U.S. military bases in Europe. Do you see those 38 remaining?
I think it's clearly expressed through this paper where there's this doctrine, Monroe Doctrine, that's being updated. So Monroe Doctrine, this is very focusing on their hemisphere. So I clearly see that they're reallocating their budget, which does actually make sense. The threats aren't the same one as we had during the Cold War, which justified all these bases in Germany, Italy, should it be also in other countries. So therefore, there's clearly threats which do make sense. And nowadays, they're no longer the gendarmes du monde, as we would say in France. So there's clearly admitted and definitely stated on this policy paper.
Yeah, right now the United States, its biggest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, leaving Mediterranean waters, leaving 0 aircraft carriers outside of Europe, which is virtually something that's been unseen since World War II. The Kremlin, too, has been reviewing what the White House has written about its national security. It seems to kind of like what it sees.
The current administration is fundamentally different from previous ones. And of course, President Trump is strong now, strong in terms of his domestic political position. This gives him the ability to adjust the concept in line with his vision. The adjustments that we see correspond in many ways to our vision.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet?
Yeah, this is an amazing factor. I mean, we talked about the Cold War. During the Cold War, there were 2 opponents, I mean, the US and Russia. What we see now is that we have, as Europeans, 2 opponents, and that's unprecedented. I mean, we used to rely on the US for security.
Are they opponents, or are they, as was just pointed by Nicolas, just simply that it's not our interest?
I agree with
as much
Nicolas
as
on
before?
something, is that we need to find our autonomy. We need to forget about this US-European alliance for the moment. I mean, for the 2 or 3 years that remains in the Trump's administration, and hopefully there will be a new president. We need to wait, and we need to try to keep the relationship maybe open, but also we have to work on our autonomy.
So what is the outlier, Richard Verly? Is it those 80 years since World War II when the United States has provided a defense shield for Europe? Is it the current situation now that Donald Trump will go away and that some more pro-NATO and pro-Atlantist president will succeed him? Or is it simply the fact that after the Cold War, we had to try to find new uses for a NATO whose raison d'etre was a Soviet Union that no longer existed?
Well, I think it's a combination of those 3 things. But as Donald Trump is now in power, we're talking with the Donald Trump administration. So what's important is to have in mind, what do this administration want from Europe? And to me, it's very clear. They want a Europe that obey the present US administration. They want European countries who pay and obey. It's not pay and disagree. It's not pay and dissent. It's not pay and debate. It's pay and obey. And that makes a huge difference, because they don't want Europeans as allies, as partners. They want Europeans as vassal country, as countries that are doing what Donald Trump is telling them. And behind Donald Trump, and in this document, you have all the question of the giant tech companies in the US. Donald Trump has written on the social media that he does not want any European government to interfere or regulate with the technology giant from the US. Why? Because this is a strategic asset for the US. They need the European market, these companies. So what we are into is a domination by the US, domination from a US administration who wants to keep our continent under the watch of the US technology company, and they want us to do what they consider important. Now, is it the sovereign right of Donald Trump to express so? Yes, no doubt. He can say whatever he wants. He does not represent the whole of America. He represents the MAGA camp, which has won the election. So we'll see in 2026 what comes up with the midterm.
Now, Giuseppe, just to give a bit of context here, among those aligned with Trump, Elon Musk calling for the abolishing of the European Union. This after last week, the Commission in Brussels, where you are, fined Musk's social media platform X 120 million euros. There's been an antitrust investigation into Meta-owned WhatsApp's AI policy. Now this Tuesday, one into Google's use of AI. You talked earlier, Giuseppe, about how Europe has to tread carefully when it comes to its dealing with the current administration, that it can throw a lot of weight around. Is it bringing a butter knife to a gunfight when it imposes this fine on Elon Musk's social media? How does it back it up if Donald Trump decides to escalate now?
Look, I believe that there was a lot of frustration among many Europeans about the fact that the European Union, or the Europeans in general, have been trying to keep the United States on board. And I believe this was done for the right reason. As I said before, there was a very difficult security situation to thread, and for that reason it was important to try to keep the United States on its side. But that sometimes may have led to risking some degree or to giving up to some degree Europe's own powers in order to avoid even worse situation. But of course, in this situation, it is important to avoid giving up on the fundamental powers that the EU has and the fundamental interest that the EU has. One of them is the continuation of a strong Europe and a strong Ukraine on its side, and therefore no imposition of an unjust peace. And at the same time, being able to regulate your own space, just like being able to regulate your own cyberspace, is quite important. So for that reason, it is that's, I think, the reason why the EU went ahead with the fine against X. It was said that it will continue to maintain and uphold its digital rights and sovereignty rights. Now, I don't know the details of the story, but I believe that in that sense, many Europeans will be happy to see that Europe is able to fight back when there is something that goes against its own interest or its own rules. Now then, the question is if the US wants to retaliate, in what ways, and consequently what the EU is able to bring back in order to counter that. It will vary from area to area. This administration is one that tends to connect a lot defense, security, and trade. So it could be possible that there would be some changes to the US desire to support Ukraine or to send more positive messages to NATO. We will see. And of course, in each of these areas, Europe is more or less prepared to counter back. It will evolve. And of course, this is also politically relevant for the US president. So it remains to be seen.
All right, so more or less prepared. I know you have to leave us early, Richard Verly, but I want to thank you for joining us. I want to give the floor to Nicolas Conquer. Europe more or less prepared to retaliate if Trump decides to escalate. First of all, you agree with this premise that Donald Trump can do what he wants, but Europe has to be able to defend its own digital sovereignty?
I also see that it's against the will of the people, because by imposing restrictions on free speech, it's trying to also dictate.
U.S. defined free speech, First Amendment, free speech absolutism, which here in Europe there are rules which are popular against things like Holocaust denying and this.
For sure. But we clearly need some sense of adaptation of this First Amendment to be codified in law versus just to have an unelected.
So there needs to be an
government.
Americanization of the notion of free speech here in Europe?
Definitely makes sense due to the threats that we're facing. Now, other than the fact to the retaliation, I don't see what glory there is just to implement additional regulations. Here, the fine is going to bring 120 million in when it costs 1 billion in compliance to be set up by all these companies. I wouldn't see any pride in getting fines when we're not providing any innovation. One of the idioms that we hear in the US is America innovates, China imitates, Europe regulates. And this is so terrible, excruciating of hearing that we're not able to create than just applying regulation onto this. And it's definitely an infringement on free speech that has been implemented through this, through hitting Elon Musk's wallet on that.
Philippe Montchevalet, what
Yes.
do the French think about this? What do they think about this notion of how far you can go with free speech and adopting Silicon Valley's
That's a very good
notion of
question.
free
We have a
speech?
law that dates back to 1881 that regulates free speech in the press, in the medias. And the problem that we have with social media is that we have two different regimens nowadays. We have one very strict thing for you guys, the journalists. It's very restrictive. You know, it's the law of 1881. That's very strict. You can't, insult anyone. You can't defame anyone. It's more restrictive than the US, okay? And then on the social media, you've got virtually very little rules. And the problem is not that we have a clear choice between these two kind of legal ways of handling free speech. The problem is we don't think about choosing between the two kind of regimes. We don't have even a debate about it. If I were to decide, I would apply the law to everyone, because why? We have a French law, a French system that works for us perfectly. We are entitled to have our own ways, our own traditions. I assure you agree with that, Nicolas Conquer. We are entitled to have our own traditions, our own ways, our own culture, our own civilization. And a civilization in France stands upon that foot, the law. And it doesn't apply to social media. It's not normal. We should apply it to everything, including X, of course, including TikTok, which, by the way, is an algorithm controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. It stands out that we should tolerate it to work, freely and among our youth, especially since China itself prevents its use to have access to it.
What is in U.S. strategic interest is an interesting concept. By the way, not all U.S. companies ready to turn their backs on Europe in a bid to compete with China. The Ford Motor Company announcing this Tuesday a plan to partner with French car maker Renault and build electric vehicles in the north near the Belgian border. Giuseppe Spatafora, is there one United States and that's how Brussels should see it, or are there several United States?
To different questions and different points. Well, first, I believe the United States has a variety of positions. This administration has a variety of positions. If you look at the area of defense, which is the one that I look at more in detail, Congress just released a National Defense Authorization Act, which is basically Congress's own defense policy, which is, of course, led by Republicans, but it is much more pro-Europe, in its words. It is much more pro-Ukraine. It codifies the need of the United States not to reduce the force posture in Europe without notifying them, nor to change the Supreme Allied Commander, and so on. So this indicates the fact that there are different positions even within the world that supports Donald Trump. Second, the company, you mentioned Ford. I'm thinking, again, in the defense world about Rheinmetall and other companies in the US that have set up joint ventures to build Patriot missiles, batteries in Europe. Europe is a big market, and US companies want to have access to that market in a variety of areas. And that's why they will, I think this is the area in which the US will push the most. On the one hand, to keep having contracts with them, but at the same time, to try to potentially reduce this regulation and other things that prevents their, at least are seen as to prevent their full access. This is also politicized to some extent. The point is that from a business perspective, the United States is still interested in Europe as a market. And this is an area that can potentially be used by the EU, for instance, in the negotiations of the implementation of the EU-US trade deal that was signed this summer.
Let me ask you, Nicolas Conquer, we know Donald Trump's not a big fan of electric vehicles. He's even pulled subsidies for them in the United States. Is this a deal that should be applauded? Jobs being created in Douai in northern France and a joint venture to build EVs between Ford and French car maker Renault?
Just for the record, Donald Trump himself purchased a Tesla from Elon Musk a couple months ago. He's all in for electrical vehicles. He's all against
pulled the subsidies,
mandates.
though.
Yeah, because you don't want to impose this. They don't work. People don't want to buy them. You just want the market to regulate himself. And therefore, you want them to be more competitive. And should they export it and build them in Europe, so be it. The fact is, you need to push back on all these EV mandates that are hypocrisy. People can afford them, and make sure that these electrical vehicles are more competitive. And as in Ford implementing and gaining market shares and partnering with Renault, it's all the best. And
all right, before we go, among those more aligned with the current thinking in Washington, if we're looking at the day's news, Czech populist billionaire Andrej Babiš sworn in as prime minister after forming a coalition that includes the Freedom and Direct Democracy anti-migrant party and the right-wing Motorists for Themselves party, which campaigned against EU environmental regulations. Now, Philippe Chevrolet, the Czech Republic, it's not the largest member of the European Union, but we do see, if you look at the count of how many parties now how many countries within the bloc sway more towards Donald Trump's way of thinking, it's a minority, but it's a growing minority.
And we have two different tendencies in Europe. We have one, traction coming from Russia, and we see political parties supporting Russia on the left and on the right. In France, both the far right and the far left are kind of supporting Russia. And we have this other influence, which is an American influence. And what we observe, as we saw in this show, is that the two different influences are kind of, mixing together, and that's pushing the far right very high up in the polls. And in the current situation is all about our sovereignty and independence. If we don't fight that political parties back, if we don't do it, we will be, subservience vassals to a kind of a authoritarian conglomerate. And that's not the way Europe has been built. Our traditions are not like that. Our identity is not this one.
Giuseppe Spatafora, just a quick head count across Europe, because we're almost out of time here. Sovereignty for Europe, does it mean, for how many Europeans does it mean a more federal Europe? For how many Europeans does it mean more nation states, what Donald Trump calls fellow patriots?
I'm sure it depends from place to place. I don't know if I have the full head count on that, but it's certainly one of the political axes that are developing between those who want more sovereignty in a national sense and those who want more sovereignty in a European sense. It depends on the scale. It depends on the kind of threats that are envisaged and the type of risks that are thought. We're going to publish soon an overview of the risks to the EU in 2026, and the United States withdrawal from Europe is seen as high among them. And but in terms of the challenges that exist, some of them are very, very large, and they are very difficult to imagine to be fought by countries more or less independently on their own. In fact, that's the feature of Europe, that if they come together, they can be a relevant actor globally if they face these challenges together. If they do it separately, it might become more difficult than it already is.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Giuseppe Spatafora, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Nicolas Conquer, Philippe Chevrolet. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.